It's been a while since I put in a plug for my buddies Edwin Crozier and Andrew Roberts, who do the Text Talk podcast in conjunction with the work that they do with the Livingston Avenue Church in Lutz, Florida. Great podcast, probably the podcast I listen to the most these days. They are taking a second pass through the Psalms, going through one Psalm every week this year, starting with Psalm 54, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago. They covered Psalm 55 last week, and I was drawn to it, especially in the context of my studies in the concept of escape recently. I had a podcast a few weeks ago on the topic of escape, and somehow Psalm 55 did not come to mind. I'm kicking myself for that now because this is one of my favorite escape passages, actually. It's Psalm 55 is titled for the choir director on the stringed instrument, A Maskell of David, and that's it. There's no context as to where this might have been inspired. It's interesting to consider it, though, in the context of Psalm 11, which presumably was written earlier. That doesn't necessarily follow, I don't suppose, but it occurs earlier in the Psalter, so presumably it was earlier. In Psalm 11, David writes, "In the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? For behold, the wicked bend the bow; they make their ready their arrow on the string to shoot in darkness at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do?" Here, and this fits in very well with the early days of David's life when he is on the run constantly from Saul, from his enemies, and he has people with him, people who wish good for him, and they suggest that he runs away and takes refuge in David's own mountain, whichever mountain that might be. There's a place where he can go, where he can be comforted, where he can be assured, he can have some confidence that he's going to be safe, which is fine. And David did a lot of running and oftentimes running to mountains. But he takes the opportunity in Psalm 11 to emphasize the confidence that I have is in God. It's not in mountains. It's not in topography or circumstances or even in weaponry. It is in knowing that God is with me. A great lesson, great psalm. But here we are in Psalm 55, and David is the one who brings up the idea of running to the mountains, ironically. Reading and starting in verse number 1, we read, "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Give heed to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I am sorely distracted because the voice of the enemy, because of the pressure of the wicked, for they bring down trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me, and terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. Behold, I would wander far away. I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hasten to my place of refuge from the stormy wind and tempest." Going through verse number 8 there. Very similar to the attitude that he refused to take in Psalm 11. I find that interesting. And relatively typical, actually, for children of God, certainly typical for me in my life. Oftentimes, I have moments of strength in times of adversity. I'm able to rise to the occasion to maximize my faith, as it were, and sometimes not so much. Sometimes the only hope that I have is in escape. If I could just get to a different place, if I could just bear up with wings like a dove and fly to some other location where different circumstances apply, where my enemy is not around, where things that are being asked of me, perhaps unfairly, are not being asked of me anymore. The idea of escaping the troubles of the day, escaping the circumstances of the day, is a very appealing concept. The entire vacation industry is based on this idea that you need to get away. You need to go to some beach somewhere or some mountain cabin somewhere. Get away from your troubles, maybe just for a week or 2 weeks. But the thing is, of course, once your vacation is over, you have to go back and you're dealing with the same troubles. Oftentimes, they're even worse than they were before. So the idea of fleeing on a temporary basis really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And David comes around to that line of thought, of course, as the psalm progresses, as is oftentimes the case in these psalms. A moment of doubt, a moment of question, a moment of weakness is emphasized in the early part of the psalm, or perhaps the middle of the psalm, so as to emphasize the strength of character that wins out in the end, the strength of faith, the strength of commitment that wins out in the end. What we have here is a testimony, and we'll read most of the psalm as we go along, I think, but we have a testimony to the power of David in his life, in his personal experiences, as his circumstances change, oftentimes not for the better. He is able to find refuge sometimes in circumstances. He's able to find refuge oftentimes, of course, in family and friends and associates. And that's a wonderful thing. And God be praised that we have people like that and circumstances like that that can lighten our load temporarily. But surely the lesson that comes across to us over and over again is the same one that we saw in Psalm 11. It's God in whom we take our refuge. In fact, the psalm is going to end with that concept. In verse number 22 and 23, cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. But you, O God, will bring them, that is the enemies, down to the pit of destruction. Men of bloodshed and deceit will not live out half their days. But I will trust in you. I have confidence in the God of heaven. And if you truly have faith, if you truly believe that God exists, if you believe that you are his child, if you believe that you have a place in his heart, that he has long-term plans for you in this life and in the next life, then surely we can find a way to retreat into that faith and to find sustenance, find courage in contemplating what God is doing for us on a daily basis. What I'd like to do is kind of hit some highlights here in the psalm and talk about this idea of escape and why it is that running away from our problems, getting away from our problems, at least trying to, is not the greatest solution, and why it's flawed in its very concept. Again, we're not necessarily suggesting that you shouldn't try under certain circumstances, at least, to minimize the difficulties in your life. I think we all do that instinctively. That can be a very productive expenditure of time and effort. I'm not opposed to fewer problems myself at all. But if that's what you're banking your hope on, if you're able to breathe another breath because you think that maybe in 5 minutes or 5 days or 5 weeks, your problem's going to be better, there's a better solution than that. And that very solution right there is fraught with difficulties, fraught with problems. And the psalm brings that out. Notice in verse number 12, for instance, after having said that he's confronting these enemies, he's asking God to give him some kind of relief. Verse 12 reads, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it, nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide myself from him." That a lot of these psalms are written seemingly with Saul in mind, but that doesn't appear to be the case here. This is someone who David was counting on, someone who was close to him. He says, "But it was you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of God in the throng," through verse number 14 there. And of course, there's some very messianic tones there. Thinking about the Judas story, it's pretty much impossible to think of this psalm without thinking about Judas there in the upper room with Jesus as he is communing with his disciples that one last time, knowing full well that Judas was going to betray him just in a few hours. That certainly has a connection to Psalm 55. But let's not overlook David's own life. Edwin was suggesting in the podcast, and I think that he's likely correct, although we couldn't prove it, no way we could prove it, that the best candidate from the David story that we have here to fit this close companion is likely Ahithophel, the counselor. He is someone who is right there in the inner circle. But after the events regarding Bathsheba and Uriah, and now in the middle of the Absalom rebellion in 2 Samuel, we see David faltering and abandoning the throne, essentially. And very quickly he hears that Ahithophel has joined forces with Absalom. And Ahithophel was someone who could be counted on constantly for good military advice. He is someone who David relied upon greatly. Many of his close associates, the ones who were closest to him, fled with him in the Absalom incident, but not Ahithophel. Others, and others besides him, joined themselves with the young upstart Absalom and took sides against David, and ultimately, of course, tried to kill David. I bring up the point with regard to us and our struggles, because if you think that going some other place is going to get you away from people who cause you trouble, I would suggest to you that maybe you're not paying attention to the people who are close to you, or at least to other relationships with people who are close to them. The greatest betrayals of all are the betrayals of people who are close to us, and it happens all the time. I hope and pray that you have not had this kind of experience, but I have had people in my life who were close to me, who I counted on, who I thought had my back, and who did not. In fact, they were turncoats. They betrayed me essentially and delivered me into the hands of my enemies. What an awful thing to say about a friend, someone that you genuinely cared about, that you continue to care about as far as that goes. I'm not suggesting that you have some kind of friend or family member or spouse or whatever that's secretly plotting to do you in. You just haven't found out about the person yet. I'm not suggesting that. Hopefully that's not the case. I'm sure in most situations it's not the case. But it is the case a lot of times. And simply thinking that you can just surround yourself by good people and good feelings, and surely that's going to be some kind of security against bad behavior and bad actions and bad attitudes. That is not necessarily the case. Again, I'm not trying to sow seeds of discord among brethren here, not suggesting that good people are actually bad people. But the philosophy of escaping is flawed in its concept, I guess you would say. Paul, when he addresses the Ephesian elders at Miletus in Acts chapter 20, he warns them there that savage wolves are going to come up from among their midst. And he appears to be talking about the elders themselves, those people there in the room with Paul at that moment. They're going to be people who are right there next to you, maybe even physically right there next to you, who will wind up being your enemies instead of your friends. Does that mean we have to be paranoid all the time? Absolutely not. But it does mean that we need to be awake and to not put too much confidence, not to put too much self-confidence, assurance in the idea, well, at least X has my back. At least Y is going to be with me all the time. God is the faithful friend. God is the one who will never betray us. That's where our confidence needs to be. We need to get away from the idea that surely there is no enemy here in among the sheepfold, as it were. Wolves are among the sheep all the time, Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7, and we need to remember that as well. Now, let's also remember this, that as enticing as it may be to get to a place where there are no problems, allegedly, where there are no problems, wouldn't it be more of an assurance? Wouldn't it be more confidence building for us if we were to have the assurance, the confidence that God is going to save us right where we are, that we don't have to run anywhere. We can stay exactly where we are, and God is going to be with us in that place, in that moment, in that problem. Notice what David writes in verse 16 and following. As for me, I shall call upon God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will complain and murmur, and he will hear my voice. He will redeem my soul in peace from the battle which is against me, for there are many who strive against me. God will hear and answer them, even the one who sits enthroned from old, with whom there is no change, and who do not fear God. These enemies are constant. They are as constant in their rebellion as they are in their persistence against David, or against you and me, if we want to put ourselves in this situation here. But God is persistent too. God does not change. God was there for David, and God will be there for us as well. Now, I hasten to add here, at least in passing, this is not intended to be some kind of assurance that you're never going to have any problem, or whatever problem you do have in the moment is going to be quickly taken care of, because God always comes to the defense of his people. Sometimes he comes to the defense of his people in the long term, over an extended period of time. Sometimes he allows us, in his wisdom, for his purposes, to stay in an unfortunate situation, and we just have to learn to deal with it. We have to learn to find patience or find faith or find hope in that moment, instead of God taking us to a different place. That being said, it is always going to be the case, good times, bad times, middle of the road times. It is always going to be the case that God is with us, and that God is ministering to us and providing what we need and lifting us up when we need it. Now, that lifting up may not take the form that we would like, because usually what we would like is to have our problems go away and have good times come and never stop coming. That doesn't tend to be the way it works. That doesn't mean God doesn't care for us. It just means that he knows better than we do what is best for us. And oftentimes what is best for us is giving us a challenge that we can meet and that we can conquer and that we can grow from, or even that we can fail and grow from. By doing that, God takes us to where we need to be. And if we have enough faith in him, we can allow him to work that process in us, and we can endure, or try to endure at least, these difficulties, these hardships. But whether we succeed or fail in the moment or not, God gives us the assurance, the constant assurance, that people of faith are His, they are secure in His hand, in His grace, and that He loves them and He is going to empower them to succeed. Now, if they determine to fail, if they quit in this process, then my soul has no pleasure in him, he says in the book of Hebrews. But if you will endure, if you will persevere through these difficult times, endure to the end, until death, Revelation 2, verse 10 tells us. If you continue to be characterized as a child of God, a flawed one certainly, but one that will continue, one that will persevere, God's salvation is assured for you. He will be there for you in the moment in some fashion. And more importantly than that, He will be there eternally for you. He will be there lifting you up in spiritual realms, giving you spiritual escape, not from the momentary problems that you may be suffering, but from this world in its entirety, from the sin and the ugliness and the deprivation of this culture. God will lift you out of this in due time. He will save you. Not by putting you in a different place, but by giving you strength and courage and hope where you are. Now, let's not tie God's hands here. God can certainly deliver His people from their troubles, from their situations. It happens all over the Bible. It's happened in your life and my life, I'm sure. But whether He does or does not, the salvation is real. The salvation is permanent in those who will be found faithful in these moments. David struggled as much as anybody did. No question about that. And certainly we're going to struggle. But if we will work through our difficulties like David did, if we can elevate our faith, our perseverance, our love for the Lord, then we can find ourselves in the same place of faith and grace and hope and salvation that David found himself in also. And one other point also. Maybe God is not delivering you from your trouble so that you will be there to handle the trouble. Maybe it's deliberate on God's end, not in a cruel sort of way, but so as to allow you to be part of some kind of larger plan that you may or may not recognize in the moment, that you may never recognize, but that will allow Him to be glorified through your actions. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to be in the hand of God in the worst possible circumstance, in this horrible, awful, painful circumstance? And we're right there in the middle of it, like Jeremiah was, like Ezekiel was. Holding to faith, proclaiming God's word, and hopefully working some kind of salvation in those, not only our own life, but also in the lives of the people who are around us. This brings up the Esther story, of course, and the great quotation from Mordecai in chapter 4 and verse 14. Who knows whether you have attained royalty for such time as this? He says, maybe, and of course that's the key word, and every preacher I know has his Esther 4:14 sermon, and this is what he emphasizes. Who knows? We don't know. I don't know. Mordecai didn't know. Esther didn't know. But it may be that God is putting you in this particular place with this particular set of horrible circumstances so He can do something great through you. Something great in you, something great in your culture, something great in your society, in your family. And as Mordecai points out here, God is going to accomplish His will one way or the other. But what a wonderful blessing it is to be allowed to be a part of this process, and how horrible it would be if we messed it up, if we forced God to go to plan B. I want to be part of plan A, don't you? I want to be the one who God can use. And oftentimes that means being in a place that I would not choose to be. Were left to myself, I would not be. God is constantly seeking someone who will go into the gap, someone who will go there and do the hard work and be hated for it and be reviled for it, maybe punished for it, but who will in that moment show what it means to be a child of God, show what it means to have faith, to have confidence in His God, in His salvation. That needs to be you and me. We can do that if God wills, if we can find the courage, if we can find the strength to do it. And looking to the example of David is going to be a great way for us to do exactly that. Again, David struggled, but David always came through in the end. And that's what you and I can do if we have enough fortitude, enough patience with ourselves, enough patience with God. And let me give you one other point before we close up here. It may be, not suggesting that it is, but it may be, and it may be with David in this moment here, that the trouble, the woe, the pain and suffering that we are going through in the moment might be of our own making. And I think in our saner moments, in our dispassionate moments, we would acknowledge that it's not God's responsibility to relieve the consequences of the actions that we chose to take against his will. This is one of the great learning opportunities for us in our walk with Christ. The opportunity to find out that we made a mistake and then to course correct, to learn a lesson, to do better the next time. And this is especially the case if we are, in fact, talking about David's relationship with Ahithophel. Ahithophel comes up in various places in the context, and we're not going to do a big character study here. But it's worth noting that in 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse number 34, he is described as being the father of a man who we find out in a sideways fashion in chapter 11, verse 3, is the father of Bathsheba. And let me help you through that a little bit and run these references later on and see how complicated this issue is. David sees a woman, he wants her. He finds out who she is. Well, it turns out this is the wife, and let's stop it right there. She's the wife. That should be enough for David to turn around and go back to his other wives, but she's married in the first place. She's married to Uriah the Hittite, which is one of David's greatest soldiers, one of his mighty men that's described also in 2 Samuel chapter 23. Married to Uriah, and also the daughter of another of David's mighty men, who is himself the son of David's greatest military advisor. That's 4 different degrees of ridiculousness that we're talking about here. Every reason in the world for David to turn around and cast his gaze someplace else. And he didn't. And Bathsheba suffered the consequence for that. Uriah certainly suffered the consequence for that. Is it possible, as Absalom is starting this rebellion, that Ahithophel has perhaps unvented frustration and hatred toward David, who did this thing to his granddaughter, who befouled her, killed a good man who was her husband, her rightful husband? Maybe Ahithophel is turning on David in this moment because David turned on Ahithophel. It kind of puts a twist to this phrase here in verse number 12. For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it, nor is a man who hates me, who has exalted himself against me, then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. If you look at that as Ahithophel eating with David, instead of David eating with Ahithophel, all of a sudden this psalm takes a whole depth of meaning for us here. Wasn't it wrong for David to do to Ahithophel, and not to mention, of course, Uriah and Bathsheba, what he did? It was absolutely wrong. And so here he finds himself at the end of the story suffering because of that. And we're told in no uncertain terms whether you believe the Ahithophel connection or not. It doesn't matter, because Nathan said specifically at the end of chapter 12 in 2 Samuel that pain and bloodshed and adversity were going to accompany David for the rest of his days because of this mistake. And the rest of 2 Samuel is telling these stories, these problems that came because David had done this horrible, horrible thing in this particular moment. Fleeing to the mountain isn't going to help in this situation. Taking up wings like a dove is not helpful. What you need to do is stay there and learn the lesson God is trying to teach you. So regardless of what your particular circumstance happens to be in this particular moment, maybe you're suffering, maybe you're going through a really hard time, but I would encourage you to read again the end of Psalm 55. Cast your burden upon the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never allow the righteous to be shaken. I will trust in you, he says at the end of verse number 23. That may not mean you getting exactly what you want in the moment. In fact, it likely won't mean that. But what it will mean is that you can choose to use your adversity, use your problems, use your difficulties to draw closer to God and increase the strength of your relationship with God if you choose to do so. Now, you don't have to do that. A lot of people have quit instead. But you don't have to quit. You can double down on your faith. You can build your faith. You can turn to yourself and say, what did I do to bring this upon myself? And would God please forgive me of that thing? Help me learn this lesson so I can do better the next time. If we will continue in these moments of difficulty to hunker down in our faith, to work harder at establishing a relationship with God, instead of trying to hope and pray that our problems all go away, learning from our problems, growing in our problems, that is a much greater blessing that God can give us in this moment than simple short-term relief. If God chooses to give us a short-term relief, that's great. We'd be glad to have that. But whether he does or does not, let's make sure that we increase our faith, we increase our commitment to his things, and we show the power that faith has in the life of the individual. I hope and pray that this has been a blessing to you, that you can grow in your faith, grow in your strength in times of adversity, and find a way to seek out God in these difficult times. Instead of running away from God, run toward God. Thank you very much for studying with us, and God bless.